So thank you so much for coming. Welcome to Pushkin House and to this very special event organized by the Anglo-Russian Culture Club, the ARC. And I think the event is particularly Archean, if I may use this word, because it really shows you a series of transformation and metamorphoses, starting from Eugene Onegin, that in itself is one of the most important cornerstones of the Russian literature, but that very much drew upon English, well, Byron in particular, English literature and French literature, German literature, actually English literature and French translation, of course, and to create this very particular new brand of Russian language and a new character. And today we are welcoming three very special guests because, well, as you can see, the inspiration was Eugene Onegin originally, Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, that inspired Vikram Seth to create his Golden Gate that was, well, really written actually in the same way as Eugene Onegin in California, and that was for Vikram the best way to show the adventures of his Californian characters. And Andrei Olear, finally, I think 30 years right after the publication, translated the book and was published by Rudomino. And Ekaterina Margolis, who is an artist, author herself, lecturer, illustrated the book. But obviously, since we like all those twists of faiths and cultures, Vikram Seth himself was unable to come today. So he asked his very good friend Michael Shipster, who is a British diplomat, who was posted to all kinds of amazing places, and like India, South Africa, and Soviet Union at the time, if I'm not mistaken, and speaks multiple languages. So he's supposed also to stand in for Vikram Seth, which I think is very, well, is very appropriate in a sense, because it's sort of everybody's replacing everyone and something truly unique is created. And Andrei comes from Tomsk, so he's also, well, he's a journalist and author and translator, and he translated Shakespeare and Brodsky and Leonard Cohen, if I'm not mistaken, and he'll probably tell more. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he's also very much interested in photography, right, and artistic photography. Katya now lives in Venice, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So we'll also have a separate evening with Katya on Sunday, where she'll talk more about her work and her new book that is very much inspired by Venice and all kind of cultural and real currents and tides as well. And Michael Shipster is a very close friend of Vikram Seth, and as I've said, a diplomat, and I think he has many amazing stories that I'm sure he'll introduce, both about his collaboration with Vikram and so many other funny things, including naming his children. And finally, I think yet another guest that we have is the man himself, Pushkin, who is supposed to travel to Vikram's place in Salisbury, so there'll be finally something really good going from Russia all the way to Salisbury. And I think that, yes, this is a truly interesting collaboration. Oh, this is the sculptor. Yes, sorry, I'm very privileged to introduce the sculptor who created this very playful Pushkin. So maybe we can also talk.
A sculptor, he's very famous Russian sculptor from Tomsk. He created this sculpture especially for our great friend Vikram. And we plan to bring this sculpture to Salisbury, but we will ask our friend to bring it.
To Delhi.
Yes.
To Delhi.
Yes.
Not now,
Today
but
to Delhi.
not
To
today.
Salisbury.
Leon Tulsov.
Yes, please welcome. So if you have any questions, for those of you who are not familiar with the Anglo-Russian Culture Club, we actually really enjoy emphasizing the sort of translation in a wider sense and transportation of cultures. So we're not focusing solely on things uniquely Russian, but on this sort of transformations and dialogue between between our cultures. So please, if you want to hear more about our events, talk to Larissa, follow us on Facebook and on the website. And without any further ado, please let me welcome again Katja, Michael, and Andrei.
It is slightly daunting to be talking here today, because all of you really come to meet and see Vikram and hear about the Golden Gate, and I'm bound to disappoint. My father, who was in the army, he gave me 3 really important pieces of advice, from a military perspective. The first thing is, you should never ever be separated from your luggage. And secondly, it's very unwise to invade Russia in winter. And thirdly, you should never volunteer. And I feel I've been volunteered for this assignment, and we sort of agreed to do it, so as not to pull the plug on this evening, only about a week ago.
Yeah, we're all
and we met for the first time
into
about 43 minutes ago. So nothing can possibly go wrong, and we have lots of angles from which to consider this extraordinary book. Now, can I first ask, how many people have read The Golden Gate in any language? Raise your hands. Okay, so not quite half. So this is good, because it's a great treat in store for you. You haven't read it yet, and I hope you will. It is an absolutely extraordinary book, and deserves to be better known. And before I start talking about the book, and to back up that claim, one of the things I said to Vikram was, okay, I'll do this, but you are going to have to send us a message, and we will read it. And incidentally, why don't you write it in sonnet form with an acrostic? Does everybody know what an acrostic is? You don't know what an acrostic is? Okay, an acrostic is where you spell something out with the first letters of each line. So the Onegin sonnet, and in Vikram's book there are 590 of them. They're all in tetrameters, that means 4 beats in the line, and they all have the same rhyming structure. Very complex. It's like squeezing yourself into a corset very tightly, and then doing a tightrope walk while blowing smoke through your nose. I mean, it is seriously hard. So Vikram, being Vikram, he said, okay, right, fine, and he's written his message to all of you, apologising for not being here, and the first letters of each line spell, sorry, I can't come. And I'm going to read this to you, and then, because he's also one not to duck a challenge.
And let me add then something about this, because it was an epidemic of writing of acrostics. It was 4 acrostics, one better than the other, in Russian. So
it was.
Yeah.
It was. And we could get diverted by going into acrostics, whereas what we really want to do is talk about the book. But it's extraordinary, because Andrei wrote a translation, and your translation is here, and it is Vina Maya Nie S Vami. Yeah. So, which basically means sorry I can't be with you, roughly. So I'm going to read it in English. This is a message from Vikram to my friends at Pushkin House, from Vikram Seth. Okay, and it goes like this. And it spells out, sorry I can't come. 14 lines. Soon it will start, the talk, the laughter, Onegin and the gate combined. Red wine and white and vodka after, Russian and English intertwined. Yet from my time zone, 5 hours deeper into the night, a fitful sleeper, can I awake my groggy ghost and raise to you a midnight toast? No? Well, at least I'll drift off, hoping that in my dreams I'll meet a bear, crouched in the snow, somehow, somewhere. Oh, distant friends, no point in moping. May we be equally at home, ensconced in Pushkin's dream or dawn.
моим друзьям в Пушкинском доме, Лондон. Вот-вот стих, смех начнут чечетку. Историй двух слияние есть. На выбор вина, после водка, английский с русским. Что за смесь? Мой дом в 5 часах к востоку. Однако с недреманным оком я вам, как призрак в свете звезд, ночной предназначаю тост. Едва ли тут Мишкою к Матвею смог бы залечь в берлогу я. Вы здесь, далекие друзья, а я хандрить при вас не смею. Мы в Пушкине с далеких пор, и стих, и дом его — собор. Я. Sorry, a couple of words about the contest of translators dedicated to this summit. I suggest Larissa to take part in a special contest dedicated to this book. Only the one line that I cannot translate into Russian on the cover of the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate, so attention, Larissa. The Golden Gate by Vikram Seth. It's an open contest. Everybody can take part and inform me about the results.
Committee.
One interesting thing is, of course, Russian doesn't have a word for gate. It's a plural.
Yes.
We'll leave that aside. What?
Small gate,
Okay, it's a golden gates.
But anyway, it's a bridge.
But look, this is the thing about this is that the circumstances which Vikram came to write the Golden Gate are quite extraordinary. They say a huge amount about him as a person and the way in which he approaches his art. You know, with some works, you can say, I don't care who wrote it, I don't know what sort of lives they led, don't need to know anything about him. We know nothing about Shakespeare, for example. It doesn't matter. You got the stuff. You got what he wrote. In the case of Vikram, you can't really appreciate what he's written without knowing something of the person. Vikram was born in 1952. He went to various schools in India. He went to school in England at Tunbridge for a couple of years, got a scholarship. He went to Oxford, and then he went to Stanford. And in Stanford, he was going to do a PhD in economics. But he found it much more interesting to go off to China and travel for 2 years, and he wrote a book called From Heaven Lake, which was a hugely successful and lovely book about traveling, very light in China. And he came back to finish his PhD. He happened to go into a bookshop, and he found there this book, second-hand, rather dog-eared, and it's a translation of Pushkin by Charles Johnson. Charles Johnson was a diplomat, which I was, but not nearly as illustrious as Charles Johnson. And in his, as a sort of hobby, he translated Russian. Incidentally, how many people here speak or understand Russian, whether as a first or good second language? Okay, so just to give us a sort of flavour. And how many people here don't speak English? Okay, everybody speaks English. Okay, just to get that straight. Anyway, this was one of those life-changing moments. I mean, he had written poetry, but he hadn't attempted anything more ambitious. He had a number of short stories that he wanted to tell about life in California. Sun, beaches, all that stuff. And he found 2 copies of Eugene Onegin, and he thought he would compare them. And in the end, very soon, he put the other one down. He read this one, he claims, 5 times in the first sort of month. And he realized that this format, 14 lines, as sort of Pushkin stanza, was the perfect vehicle for him to tell his stories about California. And he'd do it in exactly the same way. And, I mean, I have in fact tried to write one without any success at all. And he wrote 590. to complete his book. And in the book, in this book, his book, there are 5 stanzas which explain what he was about, including that he went to a publisher who said, "Oh, what are you doing next? I look forward to it very much." He said, "It's a long poem, you know, based on Pushkin," and the publisher, you know, wandered off and found someone more sane to talk to. And I'm going to read that in a moment. But in a way, the delightful circularity of this is that Vikram Seth, an Indian in exile in California, comes across a book in English, translated from Russian, of Russia's greatest poet. He writes his book in English in exactly the same format. And it's taken 32 years for someone to translate it and have it translated back into Russian. So there's a delightful circularity and completeness about this whole process. And in the introduction to the Golden Gate edition in Russian, of which there are copies downstairs, and everybody must buy one.
Absolutely, we won't let people out without it.
At the beginning of the book, there's a dedication, which I'm going to read, and then if you wouldn't mind reading your translation of it, the very first of the stanzas. Shall I read it, or shall I read it?
Yeah, you read it.
Okay. Forward to the Russian edition. For me, oh, and this is also an acrostic. It says, for Andrei Olear. Okay, so the first letters of each line spell out.
Andrei is official forward for Russian edition.
Yes. So it goes like this. For me, whose life's vocation, or half my passion, half my soul, received light from one inspiration, and being rent, was thus made whole. No words of mine could pay what's owing, debts of delight, of sight, of knowing, reality by lightness lit, excitement, sorrow, love, and wit. Yet now another's words and passion, out of that light, that second land, let me at least, at second hand, even if in so sly a fashion, at long last, by the will of Zeus, return this gift to you, O Rus.
Ах, было жил себе в полстрасти, но вышло так, свернул с пути. Другой тропой по чьей-то власти решил к себе я вдруг пойти. Едва я мог понять, откуда юг этот жаркий в сердце, чудо открытых миру жадных глаз, лукавство остроумных фраз. Есть в строчках те же жизнь и муки, а с ними жар того огня раскусит, думаю, меня уже и через другие руки. Вернуть твой дивный дар берусь, сам Зевс велел тебе, о Русь.
I think that's a brilliant translation. I mean, Vikram could choose what he wanted to say. You couldn't choose. You had to translate what he'd written. It's terrific. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What's this?
It's one additional text afterward. Vikram Seth, Ekaterina Margolis.
It's in Russian, it's an acrostic Andrei wrote for Vikram and me.
As dedication for
Post-dedication of the triple.
my father. В чужих краях, где даже звезды иначе щурятся с небес, когда-то юноша серьезный раскрыл случайно том АС. А там вдруг с джонстоновской нотой могучий голос был: «Вик, что ты? Устал от жизни в 26? Ступай и пой». И вот так есть. Единственный, кто смог все это так громко жить, любить и петь, уже проигрывает медь. Какая сила у поэта! А дальше дать ее словам таким, что и не снилось вам. Есть встреча первая, вторая, рискну сказать, через 30 лет. Иначе вышло все, но знаю, на счастье нам обрел поэт ее, чьи кисть, перо и краски могли дать облик старой сказки. Ах, как чиста и хороша рисунком, говорит душа. Грустим и радуемся вместе. От каждого его дела любовь к музыке собрала и нас в аккорд сей страстной песни. С волнением взявший карандаш АО всегда АС и ваш.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to say a few words about the book and how it was conceived and how it was first received. And I think the best place to start is with those stanzas where, in the middle of this book, rather like Pushkin, he sort of, as it were, time out, stops the action, and he addresses the reader in a very sort of informal and intimate way. He says, "Oh, by the way, I decided to do this, that, and the other, and I had these difficulties, and you've no idea, what a problem this was and stuff." And then he sort of says, "Okay, time out's finished," and then he gets on with the story. So the story of how this book came to be written is found in the sort of fifth part as you get into it. Shall I read the whole thing and then you read it, or do you want to do stanza by stanza?
As you like.
I think I'll read the whole thing.
Okay.
The whole novel.
No, the whole novel, yes. Okay. Yeah, how long do we? Okay, so it goes like this. A week ago, when I'd finished writing the chapter you've just read, and with avidity undiminished was charting out the course ahead, an editor at a plush party, well wined, provisioned, speechy, hearty, hosted by Long Live Thomas Cook, where my Tibetan travel book was on, had seized my arm. "Dear fellow, what's your next work?" "A novel." "Great! We hope that you, dear Mr. Seth," in verse, I added. He turned yellow. "How marvellously quaint," he said, and subsequently cut me dead. Professor, publisher, and critic each voiced his doubts. I felt misplaced. A writer is a mere arthritic among these muscular gods of taste. As for that sad blancmange, a poet, the world is hard. He ought to know it. Dribbling in rhymes, all very well. The question is, does spittle sell? Since staggering home in deep depression, my will's grown weak, my heart is sore, my lyre is dumb. I have therefore convoked a morale-boosting session with a few kind, if doubtful, friends who've asked me to explain my ends. There's a point where you forget this is poetry. It just sort of reads. It just sort of flows off the page. And this would be a good novel, even if it was in prose. So that's the kind of joke that you're constantly sort of enjoying as you read this. So, to continue. How do I justify this stanza, these feminine rhymes? Feminine rhyme is something like depression, session. I guess a masculine rhyme is saw and for. So the format requires a certain number of feminine rhymes as well as the masculine ones, just to make it more difficult, no smoke out of your ears. So, how do I justify this stanza, these feminine rhymes, my wrinkled muse, this whole passé extravaganza? How can I, careless of time, use the dusty bread molds of Onegin in the brave bakery of Reagan? Because he was there at the time of the prison. The loaves will surely fail to rise, or else go stale before my eyes. The truth is, I can't justify it, but as no shroud of critical terms can save my corpse from boring worms, I may as well have fun and try it. If it works, good, and if not, well, a theory won't postpone its nerve. Why, asked a friend, attempt tetrameter? Because it once was noble, yet capers before the proud pentameter, tyrant of English. I regret to see this marvellous swift meter demean its heritage and peter into mere Hudibrastic tricks. Unapostolic knacks and nicks, but why take all this quite so badly? I would not, had I world and time, to wait for reason, rhythm, rhyme to reassert themselves. But sadly, the time is not remote when I will not be here to wait. That's why. Reader, enough of this apology, but spare me, if I think it best, before I tether my monology to stake a stanza to suggest you spent some unfilled day of leisure by that original spring of pleasure, sweet-watered, fluent, clear, light, blithe. His homage merely pays a tithe of what a joy and inspiration he gave me once and does not cease to give me. Pushkin's masterpiece in Johnson's luminous translation. Eugene Onegin, like champagne, its effervescence stirs my brain. So there he's giving his tribute to Charles Johnson, whose translation inspired him to write this. And in Russian it sounds as follows.
Спустя дня три, как каравелла главы сошла со стабелей, и я, вертя штурвалом, смело повел эскадру кораблей. По курсу встретился издатель. Он был нетрезв и добр. Кстати, он выпускал, Томас Кук, мой премированный гайдбук через Тибет. Меня за локоть попридержал. Что пишем, Сет? Роман? Окей, сомнений нет. В стихах. Ему вдруг стало плохо. Я сильно скомкал разговор и обходил меня с тех пор. О, скептики, редактор, критик, профессор, я для вас ничей, как одноногий паралитик среди мускулистых силачей. Что за нытье? Вопрос к поэту. Мир мыслит прозой, знаете это? Не стоит траченного дня рифмованная болтовня. В депрессии плетусь до дому, желаний нет, сердечный стук почти не слышен. Лира вдруг охрипла, и к друзьям, знакомым, набравшись духу, пристаю. Какого черта так пою? Как объяснить, не вижу средства, строфу и рифмы. Муза вдруг сошла с ума и впала в детство. Зачем направил я свой плуг пахать Онегинское поле? К амбарам, рейгановским, что ли, решил добавить горсть зерна. И пригодится ли она? Оправдываться бесполезно, язык как саван не спасет. Пусть критик червь меня ссосет, но жизнь моя не будет пресной. Живому мертвому ли телу до теоретиков нет дела. К чему четырехстопник этот, вдруг спрашивает? Как и встать, прекрасный благородный метр, тиран английского мне жаль, увидеть быстрый ям без дела и без наследников сей мелос в ужимках ловких слов и фраз с их безнадежностью увяз. Пример один другого хуже. Я мир и время воскресил, чему ритм с рифмой в меру сил для подтверждения пусть послужит. Спешить печальная нужда, поскольку жизнь не станет ждать. Однако хватит оправданий. Читатель, милый, пожалей мои упрямства и страдания над застывающим желе, чтоб мог и ты в часы досуга в строфе изящной и упругой отыскивать свет, легкость, блеск, что просто невозможны без процентов к долгу, это ясно. Шедевру Пушкина роман был свыше нам для счастья дан, а Джонсон перевел прекрасно. Онегин – старое вино, но как волнует кровь оно.
Before I hand over to Andrei to say more about the challenges involved in translating this one piece of work, just to underline the point, this is not easy stuff. The trick is to make it look easy and to make the language just flow so that, as I said before, you forget it is in fact poetry. Summed it up, a splendid achievement, equally convincing in its exhilaration and its sadness, and the challenge is to try and render that into the language you're translating it into. Just to sort of prove that this is not easy stuff. Everybody, I'm sure, has seen or heard Tchaikovsky's great opera, Evgeny Onegin, my favourite opera, which actually, in fact, doesn't owe a lot to Pushkin's original poem. I mean, it was written by a minor poem, and I think poet and Tchaikovsky himself had a hand in it. But in a couple of the translations, when Brenin gives his fantastic aria at the end, which in some ways is the loveliest moment of the whole opera. Here are two English translations of what he's saying, basically declaring his love. He sings, just imagine, this is terrific. He said, "I wouldn't be remotely human did I not love the little woman." And another translator renders this, "I'm just a simple man of action, but I love Tatiana to distraction." And you can easily get into pastiche and sort of mawkishness, and it just looks kitsch, absolutely dreadful. And as for Johnson himself, in his introduction in this edition, he says very simply, and you get a measure of the man in the simplicity and clarity of his prose. He says, "What I've done is try to produce a reasonably accurate, rhyming version of Pushkin's work, which can at least be read with pleasure and entertainment, and which ideally might even be able to stand on its own feet as English. That, in all humility, is the aim of the present text." And he succeeded absolutely brilliantly. There are some other things which we might get onto later about how it is that an Indian student, sort of wandering the earth, from Oxford to Stanford to China, whatever, came up with this idea and made this brilliant book. And there are things and there are stories that I could tell you that would amplify the picture of the man. But I think at this point, Andrei, over to you.
I would like to say several words which I try to dedicate to my friend in this book as afterword. The Golden Gate by Vikram Seth is a novel in verse by an Indian poet written in English. This is an amazing and successful attempt to instill in the great spreading tree of English poetry a branch from equally great poetic language of Pushkin. The task that several generations of translators of Eugene Onegin couldn't achieve has been done brilliantly by an Indian author. His immaculate furniture demonstrates a genetic relationship with the main Russian novel, and the text is truly Pushkinian, and at the same time full of identity and virtuosic possession of the subtle speech resources of his own language. It's not without reason that he provoked in the West a keen interest of a wide range of readers and critics, was awarded and repeatedly reprinted. Yet for 3 decades since the birth, the novels that can be translated into several European languages still lacked one. All these years his author has been waiting, as he himself said, for the main translation into Russian. I am often asked, why did I undertake such a large and technically difficult project? What principles guided me? And in translation, they say, is only echo of a music reflected light, the underside of a tapestry. Regular metric verse, they say, has long ago been discarded from the schema of the present. I invariably reply that Joseph Brodsky once said that 7 words for Rakhmatova is the greatness of the plan, the main thing in poetry. He formulated it so easily as perhaps only he knew how. For him, paradoxes and maxims were always organic, the environment, so to speak, the habitat. I didn't matter how much his speaking about it was consistent, but for the coming generations of the poets and translators, this statement has meant to become and has become immutable given a creative task at home. frankly, not having smelled the dirty trick, I gladly believed in the absolute seriousness of what the classic had said. And then it was already late. The glow fell. And now we have to try to take a note higher in each subsequent work. In my track record, as a translator, there are Russian versions of the poem and songs of great Canadian chansonnier Leonard Cohen, translations of old Brodsky English heritage, and Shakespeareans or Shakespeare after Brodsky. You look at Shakespeare's sonnets, lyrics of Derek Walcott, Frost, Auden, modern English and American poetry, translations from Slovak, Burek, French, and even collections from poets of Nepal and Tibet. Fascinated by the translations of the original English poem by Joseph Brodsky, I suddenly learned how to read, for example, the sacred melodies of the great bard, how to achieve the density of the path, intensify the form, how using syntactic shift to leave the line as unit of Russian poetry, and so forth. That it was required to give back all the things that Brodsky resolutely took from the English metaphysical poets, from his beloved ones Auden, Lowell, and Walcott. In my after Brodsky version, Shakespeare was very funny, wit, talkative, baroque, and ironic. Cohen seems to me apocalyptically deep. Getting acquainted with the works of Western poets, reading Pushkin's translations into English and making sure that Pushkin is what is lost in translation, I suddenly came across a gigantic sparkling construction of the Golden Gate. To say that I was shocked is not to say nothing. Pushkin's lightness was present. Precise, perfect form, sparkling humor in impeccable dialogues, enchanting enchantments, fantastic thematic wells, plus a complete absence of poetism conveyed the breeze and charm of a lively conversation from a poet who doesn't know a word in Russian. Vodka he knows very well, but indeed it was not possible to predict that an Indian poet would write this, and Vikram himself confessed to me that every time he hears the beautiful music of Pushkin's lines "На холмах Грузии лежит ночная мгла," he wants to cry. Poetry leaves its obsolete forms as the soul inevitable leaves the body. In the empty shells, there is a sound of the sea like memories of the past life. Only a small number of effects of this life persists for a long time. By the way, pearls are also aging. The translation of the Golden Gate into Russian language is based very heavily on the memory of the form. It whispers to the author, to the translator behind them and to the reader, thoughts, poetic images, and plot twists. Eugene Onegin is a kind of thematic, stylistic, formal, technical canon where the possibilities of the Russian literature language are perfectly realized. Therefore, no one needs to explain anything in every even minimal reading experience in the cultural DNA code of it. There is the music of Pushkin's four-step iambic tetrameter. It doesn't matter whether the reader himself is aware of this or not. The Golden Gate is a biblical allusion and an equally rare literary form, like a certain cyclopean structure in San Francisco, are a bit holding it together powerfully. The novel of Vikram Seth is of course a tribute to bygone belle epoque, but at the same time impressively modern. Giving rise to the new content, it speaks the language if from Pushkin's extract, which continues to be an important part of the national cultural tradition. And further, definitely worth paraphrasing Belinsky said, the Golden Gate are unique encyclopedia of American life and a truly fascinating reading. Friendly ties and human contacts always rely on the need for dialogue. As was noted by academician Alexei Ukhtomsky, the whole life path of man is an uninterrupted search for a well-deserved interlocutor. The quality of the thought that you are able to offer in communications ultimately attract to you another. However, only a translator of poetry has a rare opportunity to choose an interlocutor at his own discretion and not only among contemporaries. I honestly presume that I continue to do just that. Here and all this time I managed to talk with one more infinitely favorite poet, the author of Eugene Onegin. The works on translation of almost 600 stanzas within a novel are perhaps nothing more than my incomparable, pleasurable answer to Alexander Sergeyevich is the modern poetic language. This, the Russian version of the Golden Gate, provides not only an opportunity to understand what happened to the Indian poem in the matter of poetic interpretation of social and psychological problems of modern Western society with the help of traditional methods of Russian poetry, but also gives a rare chance to assess the classical legacy of Russian literature from viewpoint of changes which occurred with the Russian literature language in the 21st century. Eugene Onegin, like champagne. Its evanescence steers my brain. In my translation it sounds as Onegin старое вино, но как волнует кровь оно. I dedicated to my friend Vikram Seth a special stanza. I wrote it during our walking in Pushkin garden in Mikhailovskaya, and I asked to every translators who are now here, and I asked Larissa to ask them to help me, because English is not my mother tongue, and I cannot do it professional, but I try to read in my own language, and everybody can help me. Vikram, maybe too. Музыка Викраму Сету. Вот так листаются страницами. Путь, как роман, спешит к концу. Все это будет долго сниться. Поэты бродят по сельцу Тригорскому, и с ними вместе мелодия прекрасной песни, что в листьях, в воздухе, в воде живет давно, всегда, везде, строфой онегинскую. Кто-то нас так заставил петь и жить, дорожка под гору бежит, скрывается за поворотом меж старых лип, где его тень гуляла с нами в этот день. I would like to say several words about our next project, because it's very important for me and for Katya. I spoke something about Joseph Brodsky and his role in my life, because my translation of English heritage of Joseph Brodsky is the main, I think, I am convinced it's the main point in my life. And the new hour project, which I waiting for illustrations for this project from Katya, new redaction and the new text which I found in Yale University in Banneker Rare Manuscript Library. 60 new English poem of Joseph Brodsky. Nobody here about. Only our Professor Valentina Polukhina. She knew everything absolutely about Brodsky, especially. And I asked Katya to be my partner in our new project.
Thank you. Proposal? I accept gladly, publicly. But yeah, let me say something about this project first. And
because I asked her to be our partner.
That project. Yes. And it's, as you all know, poetry is mostly about rhythm and rhymes, sometimes, not always. But as we're talking about rhyme poetry, Vikram Seth, there have been a lot of kind of life rhymes, destiny rhymes in the whole project in alongside them all, well, different human intersections and coincidences and things that happened and that made this book happen. As both of the previous speakers use verbal language to speak about the book, I'm supposed to be the visual, to enter the visual part of it, and I'm supposed to draw something in front of you probably, but I can't. So I'll try to just say a couple of words about the challenges of illustrating Vikram's great book, and then maybe mention some other rhymes and rhythms, both visual and non-visual. So it's very important when people write poetry, especially these days that we all use computers, phones, and keyboards. I specifically asked Vikram once, we've been friends before that book, before this project, it's a totally separate story. But I said, Vikram, do you actually type your poetry or you handwrite your poetry? And he said, I'm typing my prose, but I'm handwriting my poetry. And it was a very important point for me. That's what I felt. Because you can feel, for any Russian reader, the visual image of the Pushkin's stanzas is this kind of flying letters of the Pushkin handwriting that every Russian reader has in front of this inner sight when reads Pushkin. We just imagine, we've all seen these manuscripts, the small drawings, and we all know that as well as the text itself. So I use this as a starting point to try to work on the visual part of that book. And I asked Vikram, the first thing I did, I actually asked Vikram, since for Vikram handwriting and calligraphy, and he's deeply involved not only in the verbal part, but he's a great visual person, an artist and a calligrapher, and he studied calligraphy, and he's in study of Chinese, also involves the calligraphic, the hieroglyphic part of the text, which, as we know, was Japanese and Chinese culture encompassed. So I asked Vikram to write me the first letters, the capital letters of every chapter. And Vikram does it in Russian, but he managed to do perfectly well, both Cyrillics and Latin characters. And I used his handwriting, and he's got a beautiful calligraphy handwriting in the book. So every chapter, every chapter you find the two letters of the English and Russian text. Here it's universal, but sometimes we have more specific. That's B, whatever. So he's done all the letters that I needed, and then I also combined his own name in Cyrillics with his own handwriting. And then I should say I've done something really strange that makes myself shiver a little bit, and Vikram too. We've done this little portrait of Pushkin Vikram. That will, and here maybe I'd like to read you a few lines of my afterwords, since my afterword to that book is just solely in Russian. I will just recapitulate it in English, maybe trying to make it slightly shorter. So my afterwards is called In this Small Artist Garden in Venice, and it talks basically about the rhymes, the poetry of life, the poetry of reading of French that brought all us together here, but also which made me meet Vikram for the first time. Every time he visits our place in Venice, the first thing he does is go to my sitting room, look at the oval portrait of Pushkin displayed on my bookcases. It is a 19th century print, a gift from my grandmother, and it stays in my home in Venice. He would stop in a respectable distance and perform the tradition in the Nevsky, palms together, a couple to reverential bow. And there is nothing theatrical or it is a very private ceremony, and I've seen Vikram doing it many times with no public at all. So when I'm not there, I can still oversee him coming to that bookshelf and doing this. And it's profound, because it's a symbol of a very profound encounter. Well, as we all know, as Michael described relatively before, the story began many years ago when an ex-Oxford and Stanford student never completed his PhD. He walked in this bookstore, he, just to distract, as he said, distract himself from the columns of numbers, and it was on Chinese demography and economics, if I remember well, his PhD never completed. And he was in the final stage, and he stopped at the bookshop, and in one eternal sense, we can say that he never truly walked out. Or more precisely, the man who walked out of the bookshop with an English translation by Johnston of Eugene Onegin was another man. He never completed the dissertation, he never became a scientist, but he became Vikram Seth, the internationally acclaimed novelist and poet. So, the story is, it is quite a commonplace among Russians, I should say, to say that Pushkin is untranslatable. We all know that Chekhov and Tolstoy and a lot of Russian literature is an important part of international and European literature, but it's always been a commonplace to say that Pushkin is untranslatable, and most of our Western colleagues and friends, they do not perceive Pushkin as the kind of our Dante as we do it in Russia. So, and it is quite a commonplace to say that one can't appreciate or understand him beyond his native tongue or land that he developed. Nevertheless, it should be said that there are qualities beyond linguistic and cultural borders, and Vikram is just a perfect example of that. We met that by chance. First, it was a series of very fun events. A childhood friend, my childhood friend, for my birthday, gave me the book and said, "You'd really love this book." And it was a Golden Gate. You know, you can't believe it's written in Onegin's stanzas in English. I said, "Who is this strange guy who would do such a thing?" It was quite recently, about 8 years or 10 years ago. I have no idea, I've never read the Golden Gate. So I read the Golden Gate. It was my birthday present. And only a few months after that, at a concert, a private concert in one of the palazzo in Venice, I bumped into the author who was invited to a festival, and later he told me he didn't want to accept this invitation because he was always writing something and he's always done the same thing. There was some obstacle for him to come, but he came and we met. And so I said, like my rather snobby compatriots, the first thing was the godfather. I told him, how could you really understand Pushkin without knowing Russian? It was the worst thing one could tell Vikram meeting him. But nevertheless, he has a very good sense of humor. We became good friends. And then he won the writer-in-residence position in Venice. And it was this fellowship. He was just a year before that. There was a Venetian literature festival in Croce di Ciortale, Crossing of the Civilizations, and there was Orhan Pamuk just a year after. And next laureate was Vikram. And so it happened that he was placed in place of residence. His writer-in-residence was a place just next to my house. So we met again. We bumped into each other like neighbors. And Venice is a small town. And we became friends. And I always was something in me. I always look at Vikram, and he's like champagne himself, and he's a very kind of Mozart, Pushkin type. But I never, at some point, we had a party or an evening, and I was watching him from a little bit outside, and then it struck me really quite an obvious thing, that if I would have to look for nectar for Pushkin, if I would be filming, I would ask Vikram to Pushkin, and then I just saw he is Pushkin in a way. You can foresee, and since I'm not an Indian, I'm not unrelated to India as Vikram is unrelated to Russia, but I've never seen something like reincarnation. I never thought of it seriously, but Vikram was the first kind of thing. It was even something of his physical appearance and of his his music, of his language, and a lot of other things. And so this summer in Venice, and all it is, Vikram, he hates heat. He was looking for shade. It was really, really hot in Venice, and it's humid, and in summer it's quite unbearable. And we actually, me and my family, we tried to go north. And so once I bumped into Vikram wondering, and I said, where are you going? And he said, oh, I'm looking for some nice, maybe classroom, cool place to ride, because he was living in the upper floor of this palace. It was extremely hot. And I said, oh, you can come, I'm actually leaving, me and my daughters were leaving for vacation. You can have my key, you can use the garden, you can use the house, and the ground floor is quite cool. And this temperature sense. And yeah, so that's what happened, that Vikram spent the rest of the summer in my house, and we're doing a lot of jokes, silly jokes. I said, who is living with you? And he said, well, I will water your plants, he said, I will water your plants. And at this point I believed he's able to water some plants, of course forgot the second day. But I said, well, I just have a very important Indian gardener to look after my place. And so, but when I came back from that vacation, I found a very sweet thing. He gave me back my little rabbit kit, was my daughter's kit with a small rabbit in it. And he also left on my desk a little poem that later became a part of his later poetry book, The Summer Requiem. And the poem is in a small garden of Venice, and I'm very honored to dedicate this beautiful poem. And it says something about Pushkin that maybe this part Andrei translated can read to you, because again he cites the whole story, the whole rhyme that brought together Pushkin, Vikram, us, translations, bridges, and I think it's very symbolic that our meeting, this our encounter happened in Venice, because Venice is mostly about water, which is ensuring time, and bridges, building bridges, in quite unrelated things. So this, yeah, just as much.
Но все же я тут не один. В маленькой темной комнатке, где прямо за дверью прохлада, а также стул да узкая койка, на полке, словно иконы, озаренные синим светом лампад, пара овальных портретов черно-белых гравюр. На одном из них Пушкин. Он, никогда не выезжавший из России, уж тем более не бродивший по этому прекрасному городу, ныне дома везде. Он все те, кто знает его наизусть. Он – это я, кто пусть и не в силах читать на его языке, чувствует сердцем каждое слово. И меня бы не было здесь, если б не Пушкин. Он дал мне меня.
He gave me, says. So that's always what Mike.
I don't know, I feel we've done a lot of talking. Are there any questions or issues that you'd like to raise, and that'll elicit from us some further recollections? I mean, there are a lot of stories from certainly my 30-year-old friendship with Vikram, which tell something of the person, but I think we need to give you a chance to speak.
Strangely, I wrote a paper and gave a paper on the Golden Gate at the Baldinsky Ekaterina in 1994. At that time, of course, you hadn't translated. How wonderful that you have. And I wondered whether the thing I wrote about was the Onegin's and the form. And it seemed to me that it was both constraining but liberating. And I wondered whether that was something you found, because of the fact that Pushkin wrote that the way that he was thinking about the novel. I mean, he was inventing the novel while writing Eugene Onegin. He was inventing the genre as he went along, and it seemed that he was using that strophe with the way that it often has a twist or a change or something curious that happens at the end of each verse. And I wondered whether you saw this in the way that you translated it as well. because Pushkin said, идею свободного романа я сквозь магический кристалл еще не ясно различал. But then it seemed that the way that he invented the novel came, it was like the stropha was a kind of microcosm of that. And I don't know whether that came across in the way that you translated it, whether that helped you. Did it make it easier?
Вы знаете, здесь особенности таковы, что я предпочту говорить по-русски, потому что это очень сложный вопрос, и переводческая техника, она такова, что она потребовала времени для того, чтобы метод сложился. Потому что я не случайно свой послужной список описал перед тем, как говорил Пастернак, впасть в истину, как в ересь неслыханную простоту, выйти на уникальную викрамовую интонацию свободного словоизвлечения, легкость его музыки, легкость его стиха, в чем он принципиально абсолютно созвучен великому Александру Сергеевичу. Ни один перевод не созвучен, а Викрам созвучен. Мне понадобился Бродский, чтобы разобраться и понять, как устроена строфа в английском языке, как она работает в русском и английском языке. И я могу сказать, что я сначала сделал большую часть работы, потом вернулся и переделывал. Мне нужно было добиться принципиальной легкости этой музыки. И только когда я услышал, как звучит эта строфа по-английски, насколько она прекрасна, насколько она все-таки отличается от переводов, чем Викрам великолепен, в отличие от даже прекрасного Джонстона, потому что его музыка органична, она естественна, она оригинальна, она легка. И тот русский эквивалент, который я создавал, я не мог запихать все то количество смыслов в этот текст, их в 1,5 раза больше. Байт информации в английской строке, их огромное количество. Надо всегда решать чем-то жертвовать. Для меня очень важно было добиться музыкальности и полноценности этой интонации. И я абсолютно убежден, что это такой роман на троих. Прошу прощения, свой термин «amor de trois». Да, 3 поэта, и они без друга не могли. Это Викрам, это ваш покорный слуга, это, конечно, Александр Сергеевич. Вот как раз он и есть тот самый гвоздь, на котором держится все полотно этой картины. Ну,
I think for at least 2 reasons I'm not going to translate.
Wait, it's somebody who
To be honest, I don't know if I can translate because I wasn't prepared to there is any need for that. But I can
No.
Well,
2 reasons. First of all, it's quite a long answer. And secondly, my Russian's not up to it.
Yeah, I can say briefly. As Andrei said, but it took a while for him to elaborate the technique of this translation, because it's quite a complicated thing. So he had to go back and then rewind and come to the beginning, remember if I forgot something, and see the whole, because the density of the English text and Russian is a different density, and so he had to sacrifice something in order to achieve these, maybe the lightness and the musicality of the poem, which for Andrei was the main point. That's to, if I forgot something, no idea, but that was the main point.
And that there were 3 poets present in this work.
Triangle, yeah.
So yourself and Alexander Sergeyevich and Vikram Seth somehow coming together.
And the Pushkin is the nail on which the whole painting is hung.
I mean, it seems to me that that's an absolutely key point, that because of the way Russian is sort of built, I think you described it in one of your interviews as there's a ratio of 1 to 1.5.
Yes.
You get 1.5's worth of meaning in the same meter of English to 1, as it were, unit in Russian. So you lose, in effect, 1/3 of the meaning of the English text when you translate it to Russian, if you're going to retain the musicality, the lightness, the wit, and so on. And that's just, that's just one of the casualties.
It's
But
worth
I mean,
it.
it seems to me that the balance between, literal accuracy and music and rhythm and lightness and brio, the sort of sense of a work which is just fizzing with wit and humour and informality and emotion and so on. That's the real skill of this work. I think it's absolutely brilliant.
And that's why we decided and really set insisted on this edition to be bilingual, so most of people can just look at the English text and enjoy the Russian translation at the same time. Like it's become something like polyphony.
Yeah. There was another question there. Did you want to answer?
Yes.
And then we're going to watch a film.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, let Weiss please, more generous.
Yeah. Raise your hand up at the beginning.
Yeah, very simple really. I mean, obviously, Vikram Seth is one of the very small minority of writers who are equally accomplished as a poet and as a novelist. And I didn't realise it's quite remarkable that also he was doing a PhD in economics, which is a very different field. So
Economics is really easy. I speak from experience.
Okay. Well, somebody with such a great wide spectrum of capabilities, a real polymath. May I ask why he was never tempted to learn Russian?
It's a very good question. It occurred to me in the last few days as I was doing this. Why didn't he learn? He learned German in order to write his book, Two Lives, which is the story of his great uncle and his German Jewish great aunt. And he learned German in order to be able to translate their letters. So he could read German, in dense, fine handwriting, in order to do the research.
He had a Jewish connection as well. Wow.
Yes, his great uncle. And here's another thing. His great uncle lost one of his hands in fighting at Monte Cassino in Italy. He joined the sort of the imperial army and lost it. And after the war, he resumed his profession successfully as a dentist. I mean, talk about a one-armed paper hanger. I mean, that's just unbelievable. He was a very successful one-armed dentist. Anyway, he met and married Vikram's great aunt, who lost all her family in the Holocaust. She came from Berlin, and his book Two Lives is the story of their meeting, their two lives that intersected at that particular point, and the wider repercussions of the catastrophe that befell the world at that time. And it follows up with some of the people who were her friends in Berlin, who abandoned their acquaintance with her and her family, and the way in which her extended family perished in the Nazi camps. It's an extraordinary story. So in answer to your question, it's a good question. I mean, if he was here, we'd ask him. Does anyone know the answer?
I kind of half know, but I'm not entitled to let Vikram speak for himself.
No, come on, tell us.
No,
You'd
I won't
like
tell.
him to.
No.
He's not here. I mean,
No,
is it
no,
because he didn't think he could do it? No.
No, of course not. He's a brilliant man. He's also very musically talented. He's multi-talented.
Is it because he was too busy? No, because anything that comes along, he's got time for.
I have kind of my own mystical plan, like let Vikram, who will hear the recording that's called and say I was not supposed to say that, but I think there was no, in a way, there was no need. It's as weird as it can sound, because of this great encounter that happened, and happened quite in an absolutely abnormal, irrational way, that made this inspiration, this energy of inspiration, made him produce this beautiful work. So the language became kind of a medium, and the other thing is probably Vikram at that stage would be never able, he's not born Russian, but his Russian is supposed to be his language. He just happened to be born into another language. So he would never, the Russian he would learn would always remain a foreign language to him, while in fact it is his language, but not on a linguistic level, but it's something.
I kind of get what you're saying, actually. I do kind of, you know, sort of
That's-
intuitively
that's-
sort of think that you put your finger on it, but we should answer it.
Yeah, well, he of course said, so it's all wrong.
Did you want to
I just
answer?
wanted to ask you to tell your favorite story about Vikram, because your anecdotes about him are so
Okay.
amazing.
Do you want to watch the film first, or do you want the story?
The story first, and
the
then
story.
yeah. The story, and then
Oh,
let me
okay.
speak. Let's become finished.
All right, here we go. All right, okay. Vikram had a flat in London. He never reads Sunday newspapers, but on this one Sunday, about 14, 15 years ago, they bought the Sunday Times. And when he has a newspaper, he never looks at the property pages, but he did on that day. And if he's looking at the property pages, he's not interested in the detail because he doesn't need a property. But on that day, he looked at the property pages and he saw that there was a house for sale in Salisbury that once belonged to George Herbert, the divine Herbert, the 17th century sort of post-metaphysical poet. He was a parson, and in the tradition of British parsonages, his parsonage was about 10 times the size of his church, which is right next door, and still is. Anyway, Vikram, who was with Phillip on that day and at that time, said to Phillip, what are you doing today? And Phillip didn't have a very good answer, so they drove to Salisbury, and they visited the house. They contacted the estate agent, and he put in an offer on the house, kind of unseen, within a day or two. And then he came to our house. We live in Winchester, which is sort of not quite halfway. And we discussed it and so on. And he said, I have to have this house. I have to have this house. And at that stage, he was getting a royalty for 2 lives. And that was as much as he could afford. So there was then a protracted negotiation, which lasted probably about 4 or 5 days. And the deal was done, and within 10 days, he had actually agreed to buy a house in Salisbury, just for the fact that it belonged to George Herbert, one of his favourite poets. And I remember walking around the garden of the parsonage in Bemerton, just outside Salisbury, and we sort of went through all the sort of scenarios, rather like Brexit, was thinking, what about, what if they hold firm on this one, and what if they reject your offer, what's your fallback, and so on. And in the end, the deal was done because, partly because of his charm, partly because they needed the money and they needed to sell. The other thing about the house was it used to belong to the bass guitarist of Fleetwood Mac. That's it's a completely irrelevant story. It had absolutely nothing to do with Vikram's interest in it. But it showed, his sort of spontaneity, his irresponsibility, and his wonderful instincts. This is the house where he's stacked his books, where he has all the art, where he does calligraphy and sculpture and so on. And no aspect of the sort of artistic world is too abstruse or time-consuming for him not immediately to devote his time to it. I mean, I can remember, for example, when he was writing one of those books, I sent him a mathematical puzzle, which took me far too long. It took me about a week to solve. And Vikram solved it in 2 days, and what's more, wrote a proof, beautifully, economically, in his wonderfully sort of his wonderful calligraphy, and what's more, proved that it was unique. I mean, if you'd given him Fermat's last theorem, I bet you would have a go at it. I'm not going to tell you what the puzzle was, because I don't want to waste all your time. But it's most extraordinary, and he's perfectly capable of being utterly distracted. When he was writing A Suitable Boy, so I'm going to stop a moment, he met Jackie, my wife, mother of our 3 kids, who are sitting in the back there, Katya, Tuli and Robert, Robert is also known as Shivert, because that was the name that he gave him when we met him in India. And he discovered with Jackie, who's a pianist, music teacher, a love of Schubert. And he said that he was interested in performing the Winterreise. And he was learning German for that purpose. And so they decided that Jackie would accompany him and he would sing the complete cycle of the Winterreise, which he did in our sweltering house in Delhi in summer. We invited a group of people from the Delhi Music Society. And the thing that enchanted him most was we got a lot of roses, huge bunches of roses, because you can get those in Delhi very easily. And we piled them on the ceiling fan, and when the concert was over, we turned on the fan, and the roses were distributed throughout the whole room. They showered the audience with roses. So there's a sort of kind of brilliance and spontaneity and a sort of joie de vivre and complete fearlessness in taking on almost any aspect of human and artistic and intellectual endeavour.
Just add one more thing, because it rhymes with something again. In the book you'll see the portrait, the quadruple portrait of Vikram with an apricot. He's talking to an apricot. Actually, just before that, he was performing Schubert with my neighbor across the street, who was a pianist, singing. And then he came to my garden, we were just drinking, and he picked up an apricot. He was talking to this apricot and we're dropping it and make it fall. And then we started talking about mathematics, because I also love mathematics, and so we were talking about parables. And we're throwing these apricots and looking at these beautiful parables. And then we got quite drunk, so we went to San Marco Piazza, keeping with these apricots and frightening pigeons and tourists around. And of course later on we discovered Vikram was late for some reception he forgot, and so on. But after that, he's also very, what I want to say, he's a very generous person, so he inspires people around him. And after that, in a few months, I had an exhibition of my own that I called Parables, both in mathematical and in symbolic way. And I dedicated, of course, I owe the whole inspiration of this project to Vikram, just to this, with apricots in the air.
About the only advantage of Vikram not being here is that we can be completely uninhibited in talking about him and saying, what an extraordinary person it is. Because if he was here, he wouldn't say any of those things.
He would just interrupt us.
We would be inhibited. Shall we watch the film?
Yes.
Okay.
It's like a duel between Jens and Jake. I'm shooting you, and you're shooting me.
The first emails that was contact with the great Pushkin album girls.
I never thought much about Pushkin. One hears of Shakespeare, obviously being in India, so contact of English makes one consider the greatness of Shakespeare as a poet. Certainly you once heard of Goethe and of Dante and Homer and so on. But Pushkin has never really been much known in India, and actually, frankly, I myself didn't know much about it. And my meeting with Pushkin was purely by chance. I'm not a literary person by profession, but an economist. And by chance, I found 2 translations of Pushkin in a bookstore in California. And I began reading one of them and was absolutely carried away. It was like enchantment. I'd never read anything like this in terms of the story, in terms of the change between darkness and light, in terms of the the structure, tetrameter with feminine endings, very unusual in English, but translated by a master translator, a poet in his own right. So to me, it changed my life completely. I stopped doing my economics PhD. I began writing this novel in verse set in California called The Golden Gate, and it was completely because of this obsession with the rhythm, the ear, the feeling, the mixture of conversation and story that Pushkin has. What I loved about Pushkin is he did not take himself too seriously. He was very clear, very deep, very complex, but at the same time, on the surface, very simple. That is something you don't say about Dante, even about Shakespeare you might say, but you don't say it about Goethe. But with Pushkin, you have this lightness of touch, combined with the greatest profundity of thought. This was to me a revelation.
Now you met him the next time.
Yes.
What do you please say for our great poet? Now.
Let me put it this way. In Russia, people always say he was the great poet, he was the son of Russian poetry and so on. I don't think Pushkin would have taken himself so seriously. Pushkin did not take himself so seriously. He enjoyed life around him, he enjoyed what he ate, what he drank, the people he made love to, the trees around him, nature, Russian literature. He knew how good his poetry was. In Exiting Monumentum, he says, my poetry will live. But he didn't take himself so seriously as a person. And that is what, when people say, what do you think about great poet? I feel a personal attachment to him. When I'm with him, I don't think, oh, I'm with great Pushkin. I think almost I'm with a friend. As simple as that. And the nice thing about Pushkin is he's very tactful. Sometimes I don't want to think of Pushkin. I only want to think of the linden tree or the oak tree behind me. I don't want to think, oh, here's an oak tree. Now I must think of the poem with the cat, with the oak tree. Pushkin does not insist on saying, here I am. You know, maybe Dostoevsky says, here I am. Maybe Tolstoy also says, here I am. But Pushkin doesn't do that. He is a relaxed friend. He lets you wander. If you want to wander like a panda somewhere, you can wander. If you want to come back and talk about serious matters, you can do that. The great thing is freedom.
Позвольте мне на русском. Я, значит, можно сказать, маленький соучастник этой книги. Да. Перевод я прочитал, 4 раза чуть зарыдал. Да. И я понял, что я должен Викраму ответить тем, что он меня заставил плакать. Пушкин как-то пишет другу. Ты вот пишешь, почему не могу доехать? Не дают доезжать. В карты играю. Уже 4 раза продулся. Вместо того, чтобы писать 7-ю главу Евгения Онегина. Вот этот сюжет здесь и запечатлен. Я рад, что эта работа будет стоять у Викрама в Солсбери. Поэтому англичане теперь могут с полным основанием сказать, здесь русский дух, здесь русским пахнет.
There's the footage from Eugene Onegin, so his Russian spirit, it smells Russian.